The example of Epicureanism, a school named after its founder, Epicurus, also known as the Garden, because he set up a suburban sort of cult compound where people could come live with him and would drop out of society and practice Epicurean pursuits of pleasure. They accept the division into three parts. Although they don't like the term logic, they prefer the term canonic, which means standards or something like that. They have an empiricist concept of knowledge acquisition, so that sensation and perception is the basis of all of our knowledge. We don't have any innate knowledge. We gain it all through our sense organs, especially seeing and hearing. They have a doctrine about how we can infer about things that we can't perceive or sense from things that we do sense. For example, we can sense that there's motion going on, like I'm moving my hand right now, and even though I can't see that there's a void in here, there must be if it's possible for me to move my hand, because if there isn't void here, then there isn't empty space that my hand can be moving in, and motion would be impossible. So we can, so we can infer things building on top of sensation as a basis for our knowledge. Also, they have a view that mainly what we need to do in logic, and this is why they call it canonic, is come up with a standard for distinguishing between meaningful and meaningless terms and expressions. And they think that we've actually become very confused by introducing a lot of different scientific and philosophical terminology that doesn't correspond to the way things are. Now, in physics, they have a fascinating doctrine of atomism and void. The entire universe consists of an infinite number of indivisible microscopic atoms moving in an infinite void, constituting an infinite plurality of worlds within the universe. So they recognize that what we can see with the naked eye isn't all there is. There's other solar systems, other galaxies, and so forth beyond this one. In fact, there's an infinite number of them. They try to come up with reductionist physical explanations, so using just their theory of atoms and void, how they could explain all natural phenomena. And they claim that a lot of natural phenomena can be explained on the basis of chance and spontaneous happenings. And they reject views about divine creationism, intelligent design, and theories like that that preceded them. In ethics, they have what we call a therapeutic view, which means they think that the purpose of philosophy is to provide therapy and relieve illnesses, sicknesses, emotions, pathologies, passions, and so forth of the soul. In fact, Epicurus said that worthless are the words of a philosopher that relieve no suffering. So there's no point in doing logic or physics if it doesn't ultimately culminate in a therapeutically applicable ethical outcome. Their basic ethical view is hedonist, which means the Greek word for pleasure is hedony. They think that the end or purpose of life, you'll be happy to find out, is pleasure. They are eudaimonistic theorists in that they think that the ultimate end of human life is some kind of success or happiness, which they identify with maximizing your pleasure. They reject traditional views about the gods, about religion, about education, about virtues, and that sort of thing. They form tight-knit communities, or you might say cults, of living together, and they incorporated slaves and women into their philosophical communities. They laid a lot of stress on friendship. As I said, they have strange, from the standpoint of mainstream Greek ethics, strange views about virtue and justice, what we call a contractualist view, that there isn't any metaphysical reality about what's good or just. It's just a matter of us working out an agreement so that we can create, maximize our pleasure and minimize our pain and so forth. They also advocate withdrawal from politics and living incognito, which goes against the grain of classical Greek philosophy, which assumes that civic participation, membership, politics, and so forth ought to be the whole point of life. So Epicureanism is an interesting philosophy, and I think it has a very strange, almost bizarre, modernistic feel. Because the logic is empiricist, which is basically what our empirical sciences are, that we need to do experiments and investigations based on our senses in order to gain knowledge about things. Its physics is materialist, atoms and void, and so forth, which is still our belief about the physical world, that it consists of atoms and void, and that there are a plurality of worlds, possibly an infinite number of them. And its ethics is basically hedonistic, that the purpose of life is to get pleasure and to get through it safely without experiencing too much pain. So, that I think has had both direct and indirect influence on contemporary philosophical views. It's easy to demonstrate its influence on, for example, utilitarianism, contractualist theories of justice, things like that. But it's also had a direct scientific impact. So it's these Epicurean views about atoms and void that were later adapted and then resuscitated in the Renaissance that partially gave rise to the scientific revolution of the 17th century, which established the scientific methods and so forth that we still essentially use today. Okay, now the other philosophies that we're going to look at are bound to seem quite a bit more bizarre than this. But at the time, this seemed quite a bit more bizarre than any of them. But we have to avoid applying our own standards of what makes sense to earlier periods of time. That's a fallacy or a vice called anachronism, when you assume that everybody should think that it's, like 21st century San Diego, when you're thinking about what ancient people should have believed or what they had evidence or reason to think. So from the standpoint of the 21st century, this looks like basically obvious, like how could this not be true? This is what we all now believe. From the standpoint of when it was introduced in the 4th century BC, it looked like radical, crazy stuff that these people need to be put in like mental institutions because this is so far out. Now, I think I saw a hand raised over here. Yes?
I was kind of confused because the physics and ethics seem a little contradictory, because if everything is just a void, then how could there be one concrete definition of hedonism or pleasure?
Well, everything's not a void, everything's atoms and void.
Oh.
So atoms are material bits of things, particles. There's an infinite number of them, and they are redounding and colliding within these void spaces, and then they get combined and they interlock, and their interlocking forms different shapes, which forms different compounds and substances. For example, of elements like earth, air, water, and fire, which then combine in different formulations to give rise to different kinds of things like metals and crystals and that sort of thing, and then those kinds of bodies combine to form like organic entities, and then organic entities combine to actually form organisms, and then some of these organisms manage to survive and reproduce and others don't. So that's how their physical world is, and given that, there is no God creating this or making things good or instilling a purpose for people to have. The only purpose that we can find is that it's clear that I want to avoid feeling pain, and it's also pretty clear that I do want to feel pleasure, so that's just that's something I can immediately infer with my senses and figure out. And as best I can tell, I'm just living in a material world here, and I'm just a material body that has these experiences, and I want to try to get through it as pleasantly as possible. So in their view, it's a completely consistent view. But yes, it's important. If their view was that everything was void, there wouldn't be much more to say. In fact, it wouldn't be possible to say anything, because void is just empty space. It's like nothingness. Okay, but within this infinite void is an infinite set of atoms which are constantly rearranging and recombining according to natural laws. Question, yeah?
What is the view on consciousness?
Well, it's complicated, and we'll have to get there when we spend an entire day on Epicurean physics, I'll get into it, their views about, first of all, how living things, how can you count for living things? From dead, inanimate atoms swirling around, how do you get to something that's actually alive? And then, even if you've got something that's alive, how do you explain how it can sense things? And you would need to explain those way before you got off to explaining some high-level thing like consciousness, if there even is such a thing. Okay? One route is they might say there is no such thing as consciousness and just reduce it to some material state. That's actually a very popular view nowadays, too. Or they might try to give a materialist explanation of the phenomenon of consciousness. Okay, but we'll get into that in more detail. Yeah.
On the part of withdrawal from politics, what's their alternative to administer a society if they withdraw from politics? How a society should be administered?
Well, they think basically that's somebody else's problem. That's not our problem. We can just live like this, and we encourage all of our friends to do so. Now, in fact, they think that, well, there are some people that just that would actually be miserable if they couldn't participate in civic life and political life, and those people actually should do politics of a kind. But they have a fairly minimal concept of what a political state should do. It shouldn't get involved in religion and so forth. What it should basically be doing is making the circumstances for people to have as little pain as possible and as much pleasure as possible, and not much else. There's more to be said about their politics, and I can't summarize it here. I'm just giving you a basic impression of the overall philosophy. Yeah.
Do you have any brief explanation? And I'm sorry if you mentioned this already, on their plurality of worlds, how they believe that the universe is infinite and there's infinite numbers of worlds?
Well, again, we'll get into that when we talk about their physics, but basically they take as a starting point a sort of dialectical arrangement. What, are you saying that the world is finite? Okay, you are. What happens when I get to the edge of your world? Can I throw a spear through it? If my spear continues going beyond it, then that isn't the edge of the world, and it keeps going on. If it hits a wall and can't go beyond, a wall has to have another side to it. It can't, this three-dimensional object can't just have one side. So it must have another side, but if it has another side, then it keeps going, and that argument can be run infinitely. So there's nothing that could restrict the infinite scope of the cosmos. And it's also just a hypothetical presupposition of their system. We assume there's an infinite number of atoms moving in this infinite void space. We can't find any reason to think that those would be limited. And then from those assumptions we can explain a lot of things. And also from the assumption that there are plural other worlds, including other worlds with other life forms on them, and including other worlds with other intelligent life forms. In fact, there might be other worlds with other intelligent life forms that are essentially identical to us, sitting in classrooms right now, talking about Epicurean philosophy. In fact, that seems to necessarily follow from the idea that it's actually infinite. So there's not just another one of these happening, there's probably an infinite number of these worlds happening, and so forth. And that allows them to make certain modal arguments and other things. Now, just really quickly, some of the major figures, and I'm not going to read everything on these slides because there's a lot that I want to get to, and you can just download them because I'll put them on Triton Ed. But the school was founded by Epicurus and has had, as I said, a direct influence on later science, but also a kind of indirect influence just by creating this idea of a materialist, hedonist, empiricist philosophy. And a lot of its later modern reception comes down to the brilliance of this poem written by Lucretius, a gigantic epic didactic poem on the unlikely topic of Epicurean physics. So this isn't like Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey. It's written in the same meter and so forth, but it's actually about Epicurean physics and their radical views about religion and the gods. There's also some interesting sort of accidental things connected with Epicureanism, like the fact that there was an Epicurean library with thousands of scrolls talking about Epicurean philosophy that was in a library of Julius Caesar's son-in-law in Herculaneum, which is near modern Naples. Also, anybody been to this region near where the volcano Vesuvius is? Pompeii. It's right next door to Pompeii. Okay, the same thing that destroyed Pompeii destroyed the city of Herculaneum and buried these scrolls. And we discovered these scrolls in the mid-18th century and are still in the process of extracting them from the ground and using computerized techniques in order to unfurl them and interpret them. And for a long time, everybody thought, oh, we're going to find all the lost works of Aristotle and Sophocles and Euripides and won't this be great, all the lost treasures of Greek civilization. And most people were very disappointed to find that, no, all we're finding is all this stuff on Epicurean physics and so on. Although I think that's a great outcome. But there's lots of, this is basically one of the sources of new ancient philosophy, because we're finding works in here that have never been read before. Also, somebody that was so inspired by Epicureanism that he caused to be inscribed on a gigantic wall in a city in southwest Turkey a treatise on Epicureanism.